Unexpected symphony. The din of clinking cutlery and overlapping conversations filled the upscale restaurant, Aureole. The establishment was known for its Michelin-starred cuisine and the clientele who could afford it. Thomas Reed shifted uncomfortably in his tailored suit, checking his watch for the third time in 10 minutes. Across from him, his 7-year-old daughter Olivia's eyes darted around the room, her small fingers tapping rapidly on the pristine tablecloth. "The fish painting looks like it's swimming," Olivia whispered, her gaze fixed on the abstract artwork on the far wall. Thomas followed her line of sight and smiled faintly, grateful for the momentary calm. These lunches were rare, precious moments carved from his overwhelmingly busy schedule as CEO of Reed Innovations, a company valued at billions that specialized in sustainable technology solutions. "Yes, it does," he agreed softly, though art had never been his strength. Numbers, algorithms, business strategies, these made sense to Thomas. But the mysterious world that existed inside his daughter's mind remained largely uncharted territory. The maitre d' approached with exaggerated deference. "Mr. Reed, is everything to your satisfaction?" Thomas nodded curtly, noticing how Olivia flinched at the man's booming voice. He'd chosen a Tuesday afternoon specifically to avoid crowds, requesting a corner table away from the kitchen and main traffic areas. But the restaurant had filled unexpectedly with a corporate group, celebrating some acquisition or merger. Exactly the kind of gathering Thomas himself would typically be hosting. "The chef has prepared a special amuse-bouche," the maitre d' announced, signaling to a server who approached with a tray. Thomas watched Olivia's expression change as the server set down small plates containing elaborate, foam-topped creations. Her breathing quickened, her shoulders rising toward her ears. He recognized the signs. A sensory overload episode was imminent. "Olivia," he said gently, "we can go if you'd like." But it was too late. The crash of breaking glass from the kitchen, combined with a sudden burst of laughter from the corporate table, pushed Olivia past her threshold. Her hands flew to her ears, her body rocking as she began to wail, a high-pitched sound that cut through the sophisticated atmosphere like a siren. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Disapproving glances were exchanged. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, reaching for Olivia but knowing better than to touch her during an episode. "Olivia, it's okay. We'll leave." The maitre d' hovered nearby, visibly distressed. "Mr. Reed, perhaps—" "I'll handle this," came a calm, melodic voice. Thomas looked up to see a woman in her late 20s with warm brown eyes and curly hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her server's uniform was crisp, but her demeanor was anything but formal. "I'm Cassandra Winters," she said to Thomas, though her attention was focused on Olivia. "Everyone calls me Cassie." Without waiting for permission, she knelt beside Olivia's chair, careful to maintain some distance. "Hello, Olivia," she said, her voice dropping to a gentle cadence. "The sounds are too loud right now, aren't they?" To Thomas's surprise, Olivia's rocking slowed slightly, though her hands remained pressed against her ears. Cassie reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, smooth wooden egg. "This is my special listening stone. When things get too loud, it helps me hear only what I want to hear." She placed it on the table within Olivia's reach, then began to hum a simple, repetitive melody that somehow managed to rise above the restaurant noise without competing with it. Gradually, Olivia's hands lowered. Her tear-streaked face turned toward Cassie, then to the wooden egg. With trembling fingers, she reached for it, clutching it tightly. "That's it," Cassie encouraged. "Now, can you feel the cool smoothness? Focus on that feeling while I hum our quiet song." Thomas watched in astonishment as his daughter's breathing steadied. The wailing stopped. Olivia's focus narrowed to the wooden egg and Cassie's humming. "How did you—" he began. But Cassie gave a subtle shake of her head, continuing her gentle melody. Minutes passed. The restaurant's normal buzz resumed, though Thomas noticed several patrons still watching with undisguised curiosity. He didn't care. For the first time in public, he was witnessing someone successfully navigate Olivia through a meltdown without resorting to leaving or enduring disapproving stares. When Olivia finally looked up, Her eyes were clearer, her posture relaxed. "The stone listens," she said softly. Cassie smiled. "It does. And it's yours to keep if you'd like." Thomas cleared his throat, emotion making it difficult to speak. "Thank you," he managed, the words wholly inadequate for what he'd just witnessed. Cassie stood, professional once more. "Would you prefer a quieter table? We have a small alcove near the garden that might be more suitable." As they followed her through the restaurant, Thomas noticed something he hadn't before, how Cassie moved with a graceful confidence, how the other staff deferred to her despite her seemingly ordinary role. There was nothing ordinary about Cassandra Winters, he realized. And for the first time in a very long time, Thomas Reed found himself intrigued by something other than business prospects. Crescendo of understanding, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the lunch at Aureole. 3 days had passed, and Olivia had carried the wooden egg everywhere, calling it her quiet friend. It was the first time in years he'd seen his daughter so attached to something, or someone. "I want to see Cassie again," Olivia announced during their evening routine, her small fingers tracing the smooth contours of the wooden egg. Thomas looked up from his tablet, surprised. Olivia rarely expressed interest in seeing people outside her small circle of familiar caregivers and teachers. "You liked her, didn't you?" "She knows how to make the loud world quiet," Olivia replied simply, as if this explained everything. The truth was, Thomas had been contemplating a return to the restaurant himself. Not for the food, though it had been exceptional, but for the chance to thank Cassandra Winters properly. In his world of tech innovations and billion-dollar deals, genuine kindness was rare. What he'd witnessed had been more than professionalism. It had been a gift. The next day, Thomas cleared his afternoon schedule, something his executive assistant Priya noted with raised eyebrows. "Personal matter," he explained briefly, unused to offering explanations. Aureole was nearly empty when they arrived, exactly as Thomas had planned this time. The maitre d' recognized them immediately, his demeanor even more deferential than before. "Mr. Reed, what an unexpected pleasure. Would you prefer your usual table or perhaps the alcove again?" "The alcove, please, and—" Thomas hesitated. "Is Cassandra working today?" A knowing smile crossed the maitre d's face. "Ms. Winters is on shift, yes. I'll ensure she's assigned to your service." The alcove was a small, peaceful space with a large window overlooking a carefully manicured garden. Olivia immediately gravitated toward the window, watching a hummingbird flit between flowering plants. "Mr. Reed," came the now familiar melodic voice. "And Olivia, how lovely to see you both again." Thomas turned to find Cassie standing in the entrance, her smile genuine. She wore the same server's uniform, but today her curly hair was styled in a loose bun, tendrils framing her face. "Ms. Winters," Thomas began formally, then corrected himself. "Cassie, we came back specifically to thank you. What you did for Olivia was extraordinary." Cassie's gaze shifted to Olivia, who had turned from the window and was approaching slowly, the wooden egg clutched in her hand. "I see you've been taking good care of my listening stone," Cassie said, kneeling to Olivia's level. "It works," Olivia said earnestly. "I used it at school when Jeremy was being too loud, and I didn't have to go to the quiet corner." "That's exactly what it's for," Cassie replied, her expression warm. She looked up at Thomas. "How has she been doing otherwise?" The question was simple, but it struck Thomas that few people ever asked it. Not in a way that invited a real answer. Most people in his circle tiptoed around Olivia's sensory processing disorder, treating it as something to be managed discreetly rather than discussed. "Better," he said honestly, "though I wish I understood more about how to help her navigate these situations. May I?" Cassie gestured to the empty chair across from him. At his nod, she sat, her posture relaxed yet professional. "I worked as a music therapist before I started here. Specialized in children with sensory processing challenges." "A music therapist working as a server?" Thomas couldn't hide his surprise. A shadow crossed Cassie's face. "The clinic where I worked lost its funding. The restaurant industry pays the bills while I build a private practice." She shrugged, but Thomas sensed the casualness was practiced. "Besides, I enjoy it. Different kind of performance? Olivia had settled beside Thomas, unusually attentive to the conversation. The listening stone is actually part of a sensory toolkit I developed, Cassie continued. Simple objects with specific textures, weights, sounds, they create focal points during overwhelming moments. She reached into her pocket and produced a small fabric pouch. Would you like to see the others, Olivia? For the next half hour, Thomas watched in fascination as Cassie introduced Olivia to each item in the pouch, a small fabric square weighted with rice, a stretchy silicone band, a tiny jar of lavender-scented putty. She explained each one's purpose, demonstrating techniques for using them to manage sensory overload. What struck Thomas most was Cassie's approach. She spoke to Olivia directly, without the condescension adults often used with children, especially those with special needs. She treated Olivia's experiences as valid, her challenges as real but not defining. "You're very good at this," Thomas observed when Olivia returned to the window, contentedly stretching the silicone band while watching the garden. "It's not about being good," Cassie replied thoughtfully. "It's about listening, really listening, to what the child is experiencing. Most sensory meltdowns happen because the world becomes too much, and no one notices until it's overwhelming. Like a pressure valve that's been ignored until it bursts," Thomas said, thinking of his own experiences with Olivia. "Exactly." Cassie smiled, impressed by his analogy. The trick is recognizing the pressure building before it reaches critical levels. Their conversation flowed easily from there. Thomas found himself sharing challenges he'd never discussed with anyone, not the specialists he'd consulted, not even Olivia's mother, Diane, who had left when Olivia was 3, claiming she hadn't signed up for a special needs child. He normally guarded these personal details carefully, but something about Cassie's genuine interest and lack of judgment made it easy to talk. In turn, she shared stories from her work with children, her eyes lighting up as she described breakthrough moments. A nonverbal boy who hummed along to piano for the first time. A girl with severe anxiety who finally slept through the night after learning breathing techniques set to music. "I should probably take your order," Cassie said eventually, seeming reluctant to return to her official role, "though I've completely neglected my duties as your server." "I'd much rather continue our conversation," Thomas admitted, surprising himself with his candor. "Perhaps. Would you consider meeting with us in a professional capacity? As a consultant for Olivia?" Cassie's expression shifted, becoming more measured. "I'd be happy to provide some resources and recommendations, but my schedule is quite full with the restaurant and my existing clients." Thomas recognized the polite deflection. He'd used similar tactics, himself, when approached for business partnerships. That didn't interest him. It struck him that Cassie might be wary of his wealth and position, perhaps assuming he expected special treatment. "Of course," he said quickly. "I didn't mean to presume on our brief acquaintance." "It's not that," Cassie said, her honesty refreshing. "I'm very selective about new clients. The work requires deep commitment from everyone involved, especially parents." Her gaze was direct, unapologetic. "And forgive me for being blunt, Mr. Reed, but your reputation suggests you might be somewhat time-constrained." Thomas felt a flicker of indignation, quickly replaced by grudging respect. Few people dared speak to him so frankly. "Call me Thomas, please," he said, "and your assessment is fair. I am busy." He glanced at Olivia, still peacefully engaged with her new sensory tools. "But I'm learning that some priorities are worth rearranging schedules for." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because Cassie's expression softened. She reached into her apron and pulled out a business card. Simple, elegant, with Cassandra Winters, Music Therapy Services, printed in flowing script. "My private practice contact," she explained. "We could start with an assessment session, see if it's a good fit for Olivia." Thomas took the card, noticing the faint scent of lavender as their fingers briefly touched. "Thank you. We'd like that very much." As they ordered lunch and enjoyed a peaceful meal, Thomas found his thoughts wandering to possibilities he hadn't considered before. Not just for Olivia, though that remained his primary concern, but for himself as well. It had been a long time since he'd met someone who made him want to slow down, to listen more carefully, to see the world through different eyes. Cassandra Winters had an extraordinary gift for creating harmony from chaos. And for the first time in years, Thomas Reed felt himself drawn to a melody he hadn't even known he was missing. Harmonizing differences. The Reed estate sprawled across 5 acres in the most exclusive area of the city, a modernist marvel of glass and sustainable materials that had been featured in architectural magazines. Today, however, Thomas paced the expansive living room with uncharacteristic nervousness, checking that everything was in place for the 3rd time. "She's just a therapist." "Dad," Olivia observed from her perch on the sleek sectional sofa, her legs swinging. "Why are you acting weird?" Thomas stopped pacing, caught off guard by his daughter's perceptiveness. "I'm not acting weird. I just want to make sure everything is perfect for your session." Olivia gave him a look that seemed far too knowing for her 7 years. "You changed your shirt twice. You never do that for Dr. Blackwell." Dr. Blackwell was Olivia's longtime developmental psychologist, a stern woman with impressive credentials and a clinical approach that Thomas had once found reassuring, but now seemed lacking in comparison to Cassie's natural warmth. Before he could formulate a response, Priya appeared at the doorway. "Ms. Winters has arrived, sir." Thomas straightened his casual blue button-down, chosen carefully after discarding both a suit, too formal, and a t-shirt, too casual, and nodded. "Show her in, please." Cassie entered the room with the same graceful confidence she'd displayed at the restaurant, though today she wore fitted jeans and a soft green blouse rather than a server's uniform. She carried a large canvas bag emblazoned with musical notes. "Cassie!" Olivia jumped up, running to greet her, a display of enthusiasm Thomas rarely witnessed with new people. "Hello, Olivia," Cassie smiled, kneeling briefly to the child's level. "I've brought some special things to share with you today." She stood, turning to Thomas with a warm but professional smile. "And hello to you too, Thomas. Thank you for having me in your home." "Thank you for coming," he replied, suddenly aware of how the vastness of his home might appear. Cassie's eyes had widened slightly as she took in the soaring ceilings, the wall of windows overlooking the city, the obvious displays of wealth that Thomas had long since stopped noticing. If she was intimidated, she recovered quickly, setting down her bag and pulling out a portable speaker, several small instruments, and what looked like a tablet in a rugged case. "I thought we'd start with a baseline session," she explained, arranging her materials on the coffee table, just to get a sense of Olivia's responses to different auditory and tactile stimuli. "From there, we can develop a personalized program." Thomas nodded, appreciating her methodical approach. "Should I leave you two alone?" "Actually, I'd prefer you stay," Cassie said. "Parent involvement is crucial for continuity between sessions." For the next hour, Thomas watched in fascination as Cassie led Olivia through a series of activities. Listening exercises where Olivia identified feelings associated with different sounds, rhythmic games that had her giggling as she tried to match Cassie's patterns, gentle tactile explorations with fabric swatches, feathers, and textured balls. Throughout it all, Cassie maintained a perfect balance of structure and playfulness, challenging Olivia without overwhelming her. She took careful notes on her tablet, occasionally explaining her observations to Thomas. "She's particularly sensitive to higher frequencies," Cassie noted after one exercise. "And notice how she leans in for deeper bass tones? That's a seeking behavior. Her nervous system finds those vibrations organizing rather than disruptive." "I had no idea," Thomas admitted, remembering how Olivia often asked him to speak in a lower voice when upset. "So many things make sense now." "That's exactly why I do this work," Cassie replied, her eyes lighting up with genuine passion. "These children aren't broken or difficult. They're experiencing the world in a different way. Once we understand their sensory map, we can help them navigate more comfortably." As the session concluded, Olivia seemed energized rather than drained, a stark contrast to her usual state after therapy appointments. "Can I show Cassie my room?" she asked Thomas eagerly. "If Ms. Winters has time," Thomas hedged, not wanting to impose. "I'd love to see it," Cassie assured them. "It's helpful to understand Olivia's regular environment." While Olivia led Cassie upstairs, Thomas found himself straightening magazines on the coffee table, oddly concerned about the impression his home was making. The Reed estate reflected his aesthetic: minimalist, efficient, technologically advanced. But suddenly he wondered if it might seem cold or impersonal to someone like Cassie, whose approach centered on warmth and connection. When they returned, Olivia was chattering excitedly about the adaptive lighting system Thomas had installed in her room, a sophisticated setup that allowed her to control color temperature and brightness to suit her sensory needs. "That's absolutely brilliant," Cassie was saying, genuine admiration in her voice. "I've recommended similar systems to clients, but nothing so comprehensive." "It's just a prototype," Thomas explained modestly. "Something my R&D team developed when I mentioned Olivia's light sensitivity." Cassie looked at him with newfound interest. "You created custom technology for her sensory needs?" "It seemed like the obvious solution," Thomas shrugged. "Technology is what I understand." "Don't underestimate that approach," Cassie said earnestly. "So many of these children would benefit from adaptive environments. The commercial options are limited and prohibitively expensive for most families." Thomas had never considered the broader applications beyond Olivia's needs. "You think there would be wider interest in something like this?" "Absolutely," Cassie affirmed. "Schools, therapy centers, families, affordable sensory adaptive technology would be revolutionary." Her expression grew animated as she continued. "Imagine classrooms where each child could adjust their sensory input without disrupting others, or therapy spaces that could transform to meet different needs throughout the day." Thomas felt a familiar stirring, the same feeling he experienced when encountering a problem with an elegant technological solution. "What other applications do you envision?" Over tea in the kitchen, Cassie had politely declined Priya's offer of something more elaborate. They discussed possibilities. Cassie described challenges her clients faced, and Thomas found himself mentally sketching prototype designs, asking questions about specific needs, occasionally making notes on his tablet. "I'm sorry," Cassie said eventually, glancing at her watch. "I've completely lost track of time, and I have another client in 30 minutes. "No, I'm the one who should apologize for hijacking the conversation," Thomas replied, reluctant to see her leave. "This was meant to be about Olivia's therapy plan." "It still was," Cassie assured him, gathering her materials. "Everything we discussed would benefit her and children like her." She paused, seeming to consider something. "Actually, if you're serious about developing these ideas further, I'm consulting on a new sensory integration room at the Children's Center downtown. They have a limited budget but ambitious goals. It might be an interesting test case." Thomas recognized the opportunity she was offering, a chance to see her again in a context that maintained professional boundaries while exploring their shared interest in helping children like Olivia. "I'd be very interested," he said, careful to keep his tone measured. "Reed Innovations has a foundation that might be able to support the project." Cassie's expression flickered with something, wariness perhaps. "I wasn't suggesting—" "I know," Thomas interrupted gently. "But meaningful collaboration benefits everyone, doesn't it? No strings attached." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "The center's director is holding a planning meeting next Thursday afternoon. Would you be available to join?" "I'll make myself available," Thomas promised, already mentally rearranging his calendar. After scheduling Olivia's next therapy session and saying their goodbyes, Thomas found himself standing in the foyer long after Cassie's modest sedan had disappeared down the driveway. "She's nice," Olivia said, appearing at his side and slipping her small hand into his. "Different from the other doctors." "Yes," Thomas agreed softly. "She certainly is." That evening, instead of returning to work as he typically would, Thomas sat at his design station in his home office, sketching ideas for sensory adaptive spaces. For the first time in years, he felt inspired by something beyond market opportunities or competitive advantages. This was personal, not just for Olivia, but for the countless children Cassie had described, children whose experiences of the world could be transformed with the right tools. And perhaps, in the process of building these bridges for others, He might find a way to cross the distance he'd created in his own life. The careful separation between personal and professional, between vulnerability and control, Cassandra Winters had introduced a new variable into his carefully ordered existence. And Thomas Reed, who had built his fortune on predicting outcomes, found himself embracing the uncertainty of what might develop. Perfect cadence continued. He caught sight of Cassie across the room, deep in conversation with a group of therapists who had come to learn about the innovative space. She was animated, passionate, her hands moving expressively as she explained something about the sound design. Thomas felt a familiar warmth at the sight, admiration, mixed with something deeper that had grown steadily despite his attempts to maintain professional distance in the 3 weeks since their late-night conversation in this very room. They had spoken only about project details. Cassie had not mentioned the consulting position, and Thomas had respected her need for space to consider both the professional opportunity and the personal implications. Quite the philanthropic triumph, came Diane's cool voice beside him. She had arrived fashionably late, dressed impeccably in a designer suit that seemed excessive for a Saturday morning children's event. The board is impressed. So am I, actually. It's not about impressing anyone, Thomas replied, keeping his voice low. It's about creating something that actually helps children like Olivia. Diane studied him for a moment. You've changed, Thomas. It's interesting. Before he could respond, the center's communications director called for everyone's attention. A brief ceremony followed. Ribbons were cut, speeches given. Joe spoke eloquently about the transformative potential of the space, acknowledging the contributions of everyone involved. When she called Cassie and Thomas forward to say a few words, Thomas noticed Diane watching with calculated interest. This project began as a simple idea, Cassie said, her clear voice carrying throughout the room. Create a space where children with sensory processing challenges could find both comfort and stimulation on their own terms. But it became something more. A model for what's possible when expertise and resources align with genuine compassion. She turned slightly toward Thomas. Some people see problems to solve. The truly visionary see possibilities to create. When it was Thomas's turn to speak, he kept his remarks brief, focusing on the collaborative nature of the project and the technical innovations that made it accessible. He avoided looking directly at Cassie, aware of Diane's scrutiny. After the ceremony, as families explored the room and professionals networked, Thomas found himself cornered by a local reporter wanting details about Reed Innovations' involvement. He answered the questions mechanically, his attention divided as he tracked Cassie's movements around the room. One last question, Mr. Reed, the reporter said. There are rumors that this project represents a new direction for Reed Innovations, developing technologies specifically for special needs applications. Can you confirm this initiative? Thomas hesitated. Without Cassie's acceptance of the consulting role, the initiative remained uncertain. We're exploring possibilities, he said carefully. The potential is certainly there. As the reporter thanked him and moved away, Thomas noticed Diane approaching Cassie, who was demonstrating the adaptive lighting controls to a group of parents. He made his way closer, instinctively wary of whatever his ex-wife might be saying. Must be gratifying to see your ideas implemented on such a scale, Diane was saying, her tone pleasant but assessing. Thomas mentioned you might be joining Reed Innovations as a consultant. We've discussed possibilities, Cassie replied diplomatically, continuing her demonstration without missing a beat. You should know that Thomas tends to compartmentalize his interests, Diane continued. Business ventures rarely intersect with his personal life for long. It's one of his more predictable patterns. Thomas stepped forward, his patience exhausted. Diane, I'm sure the board members would appreciate your insights on the center's upcoming fundraising strategy. Diane smiled thinly. Just offering some context from someone who knows you well, Thomas. To Cassie, she added. No offense intended, of course. None taken, Cassie replied with remarkable composure. And thank you for the perspective, Mrs. Mercer. In my experience, though, past patterns aren't always reliable predictors of future choices. People can surprise you when given the right motivation to change. Something in her tone, confident, unintimidated, seemed to catch Diane off guard. After a moment of silence, she offered a tight smile and excused herself to greet a prominent donor. "You handled that beautifully," Thomas said quietly when they were alone. "I've dealt with more challenging personalities in my therapy practice," Cassie replied with a hint of amusement. Her expression grew more serious. "She's not entirely wrong, though, is she? About your compartmentalized life?" Thomas considered this. "It was true for a long time," he admitted. "Work in one box, Olivia in another, everything else kept carefully separate. It seemed efficient. And now," Cassie asked, her gaze direct, "now I'm learning that the most valuable connections are the ones that cross those boundaries," Thomas said. "That real innovation happens at the intersections." A small smile touched Cassie's lips. "That's a very evolved perspective for an engineer." "I had an excellent teacher," Thomas replied, allowing his own smile to emerge. "Speaking of which, have you given any thought to the consulting position?" Cassie glanced around the bustling room, children exploring the sensory features, parents watching with hope and relief, professionals taking notes on the design elements. "I have," she said, "and I've decided to accept with conditions." Thomas felt a surge of relief. "Name them." "First, I maintain my private practice, scaled back but not eliminated. These children still need direct therapy, not just better equipment." "Absolutely," Thomas agreed immediately. "Whatever schedule works for you." "Second, I want documented creative control over the therapeutic applications. No marketing considerations override clinical efficacy." "Done. I'll have legal draw up the terms exactly as you want them." Cassie nodded, then took a deep breath. "And third, Olivia needs to transition to another therapist. I've already spoken with a colleague who would be perfect for her." Thomas understood the implication immediately. "You're creating professional space for personal possibilities." "I am," Cassie confirmed, her expression softening. "If that's still something you'd like to explore." Before Thomas could respond, Olivia appeared at his side, tugging at his hand. "Dad, come see what I made in the creation corner." "You too, Cassie." They followed her to a quiet alcove where a digital composition station had been set up, one of the last features added to the room at Cassie's suggestion. Olivia proudly showed them a simple melody she had created, a gentle repeating pattern that reflected the same soothing quality Cassie often used in their sessions. "It's beautiful." "Olivia," Cassie praised, kneeling beside her, "how does it make you feel when you listen to it?" "Calm," Olivia replied thoughtfully. "Like when you and Dad are both with me and everything feels right." The innocent observation hung in the air between them. Thomas met Cassie's eyes over his daughter's head, finding in them the same wonder and possibility he felt. Later, as the event wound down and the center emptied of visitors, Thomas found Cassie in the now quiet sensory room, adjusting the settings on the bubble columns. Soft ambient lighting created a peaceful atmosphere, the sound system playing gentle nature sounds at a low volume. The day was a success, he observed, joining her. "Beyond expectations," Cassie agreed, turning to face him. "This room will help so many children." "And the larger project?" Thomas asked. "The one we discussed?" Cassie smiled, understanding he meant more than just the consulting arrangement. "I think it has extraordinary potential, though it will require patience, careful development, and a willingness to adapt to feedback," Thomas added, moving closer. "Exactly." Cassie's eyes held his. "Not unlike the process that created this room." "I was thinking," Thomas said softly, "that before we begin this new project, we should properly celebrate the completion of this one. Perhaps dinner? Just the two of us?" "I'd like that," Cassie replied. "Though I should warn you, I have very specific sensory preferences for restaurants." Thomas laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. "I believe I know just the place, an exceptional establishment with a particularly gifted waitress." "Former waitress," Cassie corrected with a smile. "I gave my notice at Oriole last week. It seems I have a new career opportunity that will require my full attention." "A promising development," Thomas murmured, closing the distance between them. "Very promising," Cassie agreed, her hand finding his. Around them, The room they had created together hummed with possibility, light and sound and texture working in perfect harmony, just as the unexpected connection between a reserved tech mogul and a compassionate therapist had created something neither could have built alone. 6 months later, the Reed Sensory Integration Systems line was preparing for its first major release. The prototype products, ranging from adaptive lighting to interactive sound panels to portable sensory kits, had been tested in schools and therapy centers across the country with remarkable results. What had begun as a single room in a downtown children's center had expanded into an initiative that promised to make sensory integration, therapy accessible to families regardless of income or location. Thomas stood at the window of his office, watching as Cassie led a training session for therapists in the demonstration room below. She moved with confident grace, explaining the therapeutic applications of each piece of equipment with the perfect balance of technical precision and dissonant movements. The Children's Center downtown was a stark contrast to the sleek sophistication of Reed Innovations headquarters. Housed in a renovated factory building, its brick walls were brightened by children's artwork and motivational quotes. As Thomas followed the hand-drawn signs toward the conference room, he felt oddly out of place in his designer suit, a sensation he rarely experienced anywhere. The planning meeting for the sensory integration room was already underway when he arrived, slightly delayed by an emergency call with his Tokyo office. 6 people sat around a battered table covered with blueprints and material samples. Cassie was among them, deep in conversation with an older woman whose gray dreadlocks were gathered in a colorful scarf. "Simply don't have the budget for both the interactive floor and the bubble columns," the woman was saying, frustration evident in her tone. Cassie looked up as Thomas entered, her expression brightening. "Speaking of resources, everyone, this is Thomas Reed of Reed Innovations. He's expressed interest in our project." All conversation ceased as heads turned toward him. Thomas recognized the familiar mix of reactions his presence typically generated: curiosity, deference, and in some cases, immediate calculation of what his involvement might mean. "Sorry I'm late," he said, taking the empty chair beside Cassie. "Unexpected situation overseas." "We're just grateful you're here," the woman with the dreadlocks replied warmly. "I'm Director Josephine Barnes. Most people call me Joe." Introductions followed: the center's occupational therapist, architect, financial officer, and parent representative. Thomas noted how Cassie interacted with each of them, her natural rapport evident in small gestures, a knowing smile with the OT, a gentle touch on Joe's arm, an encouraging nod to the nervous parent representative. "We were just discussing budget constraints," Joe explained, pushing a spreadsheet toward him. "As you can see, our grant covers the basic renovation, but the specialized equipment that would make this a truly transformative space is prohibitively expensive." Thomas finished, scanning the figures. "May I?" At Joe's nod, he pulled the blueprints closer, quickly absorbing the proposed layout. His mind immediately began calculating efficiencies, alternatives, integrations. This was familiar territory, problem-solving with constraints. For the next hour, Thomas listened more than he spoke, observing the passionate commitment everyone brought to the project. Cassie's expertise was evident as she explained how different elements would address specific sensory needs, her hands moving expressively as she described the ideal progression through the space. "The challenge," the financial officer explained wearily, "is that we have exactly half the budget needed for Ms. Winters' complete vision. We'll have to compromise somewhere, or find additional funding," Thomas suggested quietly. A brief silence followed. "Mr. Reed," Joe began carefully, "while we appreciate your interest, we're wary of becoming dependent on private donors whose priorities might shift. Our children need sustainability." Thomas respected her directness. A valid concern. What if the additional resources came with a 5-year commitment and technology that would significantly reduce ongoing maintenance costs? The conversation shifted to specifics, Thomas outlining how Reed Innovations could not only provide funding, but also adapt some of their existing technologies to create more affordable, maintainable versions of the expensive sensory equipment. By the meeting's end, the mood had transformed from resignation to cautious optimism. "This could actually happen," the parent representative said wonderingly, looking at the revised plans. As the group dispersed, Cassie lingered, helping Joe organize the materials. "That was impressive," she said to Thomas once they were alone. "You found solutions none of us had considered." "It's what I do," Thomas replied with a small smile. "Besides, you were the one who created the vision. I'm just helping with implementation." "Still," Cassie insisted, "not many CEOs would spend their Thursday afternoon solving problems for a non-profit children's center." Before Thomas could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Well, this is unexpected." He turned to find Diane Mercer, formerly Diane Reed, standing in the doorway, her trademark scarlet lipstick and perfectly tailored suit as impeccable as ever. Her gaze shifted between Thomas and Cassie with undisguised interest. "Diane?" Thomas acknowledged, surprised. "What brings you here?" "I'm on the center's board now," she replied smoothly, entering the room. "Mercer Foundation is a major donor. Corporate social responsibility is so important these days, isn't it?" The slight emphasis on corporate reminded Thomas of their fundamental difference. His ex-wife had always seen philanthropy as a strategic business move rather than a moral imperative. "Diane, this is Cassandra Winters," Thomas said, noting how Cassie had straightened, her relaxed demeanor replaced by something more guarded. "She's a music therapist working with Olivia and consulting on this project." "How interesting," Diane said, extending a manicured hand. Thomas never mentioned Olivia was seeing a new specialist. "I would have expected to be consulted given our co-parenting arrangement." The pointed remark hung in the air. Though Diane had relinquished primary custody years ago, she maintained legal decision-making rights and occasionally exercised them, usually when it suited her public image as a devoted mother despite her limited actual involvement in Olivia's life. "It's a relatively recent development," Thomas explained evenly. "Well, Ms. Winters, I'd love to hear more about your approach," Diane continued, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Perhaps we could schedule a meeting to discuss Olivia's treatment plan. As her mother, I'm naturally concerned about any new interventions." Cassie handled the situation with professional grace. "Of course, Mrs. Mercer, I'd be happy to review Olivia's progress with you both." "How accommodating," Diane murmured. Her phone chimed and she glanced at it dismissively. "I'm afraid I have another commitment. Thomas, I'll call you about setting that up." With a final assessing look between them, she departed as suddenly as she had appeared. An uncomfortable silence settled in her wake. "I should have mentioned that my ex-wife is involved with the center," Thomas said finally. "I honestly had no idea." "It's fine," Cassie assured him, though her manner had changed subtly. "She has every right to be involved in Olivia's care." "Diane's involvement in Olivia's life is complicated," Thomas said carefully. "Our divorce wasn't amicable, and her relationship with Olivia has been inconsistent at best." "It's not my place to judge," Cassie replied, gathering her notes. "Family dynamics always are complex." As they walked together toward the parking lot, Thomas sensed a new distance between them, as if Diane's appearance had reminded Cassie of all the complications surrounding the Reed family. "Olivia is looking forward to her session tomorrow," Thomas said, trying to recapture their earlier ease. "I've planned some new activities based on what worked well last time," Cassie responded, professional but lacking the warmth he'd grown accustomed to. At her car, she hesitated. "Thomas, I should probably clarify something. While I'm committed to this project and to Olivia's therapy, I need to maintain appropriate professional boundaries." The statement felt like a door closing. "Have I done something to make you uncomfortable?" "Not at all," Cassie said quickly. "It's just, I've worked with high-profile families before. Things can get complicated when personal and professional lines blur." She didn't need to mention Diane explicitly for Thomas to understand her concerns. "I respect that completely," he assured her, though disappointment settled heavily in his chest. "My only priority is helping Olivia and supporting this project." Cassie's expression softened slightly. Thank you for understanding." As Thomas watched her drive away, he couldn't help feeling that something promising had been interrupted before it had properly begun. The easy connection they'd been building had encountered its first real obstacle, the complicated reality of his life, with all its baggage and scrutiny. The following weeks brought a flurry of activity around the sensory room project. Thomas threw himself into the work, allocating substantial resources from Reed Innovations' R&D department to develop affordable versions of key equipment. His team created prototypes for interactive light panels, custom sound systems, and adaptable seating that could be manufactured at a fraction of the commercial cost. Cassie remained deeply involved, her expertise guiding the design decisions, but the easy rapport they had shared seemed diminished. Their interactions were cordial and productive, but carefully constrained to project matters and Olivia's therapy. The meeting with Diane about Olivia's treatment had been tense, but ultimately uneventful. After questioning Cassie extensively about her credentials and methodology, Diane had apparently lost interest, offering a perfunctory approval before changing the subject to her upcoming charity gala. What Thomas hadn't anticipated was Diane's subsequent increased presence in Olivia's life. After months of minimal contact, she suddenly began scheduling regular outings and video calls, even appearing unexpectedly at school events. While Olivia seemed cautiously pleased by her mother's attention, Thomas couldn't shake the suspicion that Diane's renewed interest had more to do with him than their daughter. "Ms. Winters seems very dedicated," Diane remarked during one of her now frequent calls, "and surprisingly insightful for someone working as a waitress.